Hello and welcome to another episode of Mic'd, the official podcast of St. Michael Catholic Church, Gastonia, North Carolina. I am your host and director of evangelization in this great parish, Shane Page, and I am joined this week once again with the bodacious Father Rossi. Yes, where we are invested, transformed, so that we can be fully the Lord Jesus Christ. That's what we're about. How are you, Father?
I'm doing very well. It's been the Easter's going quickly. The Easter season. We're already up on our...
Is it fourth week? We're going up on the fifth week.
Yep.
We're almost where the fifth would have been the fifth week of Lent. That seemed like a crawl.
Right, I know.
And Easter is it's zipping by.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's definitely zipping by. We had a great spring gala fundraiser for our school last Saturday. You were there. And
I was there.
The gym turned into Narnia. Absolutely amazing job by
wasn't
amazing
it? I couldn't imagine the
volunteers.
manpower and then the volunteer hours.
Yes, many hours, many days, many sacrifices, and also we were able to welcome Mr. Joseph Pierce, Catholic author, and he was the keynote speaker. Spoke on several books of Narnia, gave us some insights into the characters, into the way in which C.S. Lewis wrote, and so it was a wonderful evening for all.
Yeah, it was a great evening, and of course he had that great British accent. And people in the South in the United States will listen to anybody that has the British accent.
Right.
Just like when I when I would visit my in-laws in Kansas, especially when I had first met my wife. She wasn't my wife at the time, but I would visit with her family. They just wanted to hear me talk. And that's because I sounded like a hick to them. And I'm like, wow. To me, I just sounded normal. But then when I hear tapes of myself, I'm like, oh, my goodness. Yes, I'm from North Carolina. I'm from Gastonia, North Carolina at that. So when I travel to the Midwest, I have people's attention here.
Right.
It's just, I know when I served a parish in Iredell County, there was a couple of times where I would run into someone and he would have a conversation with me while my wife was in the car, like at a gas station somewhere. And her window was down, and then I would get in the car, and she says, I'm sorry, I had no idea what he just said the whole time. I didn't understand a word he said. I was just having a conversation with him.
That's a good segue into probably what you want to talk about no idea what's being said.
Oh, yeah, well, that's true. That's true. So our listeners out there, if this is going to be a disastrous podcast for the next couple of weeks, it's my fault, not Father's, because what I wanted to do is, and this was inspired by the Liturgy of the Hours, the Divine Office. So since Easter has begun, we are reading daily, except for maybe a feast day, Revelation, the letter of Revelation. And for most people, we shy away from it. We don't know what this the last book of the New Testament. We know that. Jesus wins. We hear that. Oh, okay, well, we know that. But to really talk about what it means, because it is absolutely, once I began to get into the scholarship of it and how it was employed in first century Judaism and what it would have meant in first century Judaism, it's one of my favorite books of the New Testament. I actually love it. And, I actually think it is one of the most relevant for Christians living in the West, even in the United States. But the problem is that it has been hijacked by all these outlandish interpretations that have no bearing in how it's really meant to be understood. So for many non-Catholics, it predicts the end of the world. Not true. For many Catholics, they might invoke Scott Hahn's great book on Revelation. I bet you read it. Did you read it? On Revelation, when he really talks about the imagery of the Mass.
No, I read Holy is His Name, and he speaks about Revelation at the end of that, but no, not.
Yeah, well, he's got a great book on the Mass and Apocalypse, and he's right in many of his ways, but even Hahn's book skips what we would say as Catholics, the social implications or the social teaching about this. So, all that to be said, and I hope I don't bore you,
no one finds Revelation boring.
Well, I hope I don't make it boring. Is to spend the next couple of weeks not looking at everything, because you would be a retired priest by the time we finish that, but going over some portions of it so that we can understand, make it make sense, and maybe as a way to analogize this. In Revelation 21, John sees this great vision of the New Jerusalem coming down to earth. Comes down. And this is the culmination of his great vision. Well, we need to bring the letter of Revelation. It needs to come down to earth. Wah, wah. You know, I mean, I know that's a corny way to put it, but this needs to be put down to earth. So what we're going to do today is I just thought I would at least put it in context, because all of our Catholic listeners or non-Catholics, we should not be afraid of it. But the thing is that we are fascinated by thinking of Revelation as a code for the end of the world, which it's not, or it teaches something called rapture, which it does not. And even rapture is rejected by the Catholic Church.
What passages in Revelation is the word rapture used?
It's not used at all.
I know.
Yeah. And it's not anywhere in there. Heaven comes to us. We'll get to that maybe in a couple of weeks.
Boy,
we don't go up to heaven. Heaven comes down to us. That's where Revelation is heading things. But the problem is that we're fascinated by these outlandish interpretations when we really understand what John is saying.
Now, this is the
That's more interesting.
The gospel writer of the Gospel of John.
Well, see, we can talk about that. I don't know. I think so, but there are those who speculate because the literary style is a little bit different than what we find in John's Gospel and in the Johannine epistles. But he's certainly speaking with John's voice. It may not be his actual writing, but it's certainly his voice. But we know it's a John. He names himself.
Right.
And he sees a vision. Now, what's fascinating about Revelation is that you've got to understand or really be knowledgeable of your Old Testament. Did you know, Father, that there are more than 500 allusions to the Old Testament in the letter of Revelation?
I did not know that. Wow.
Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, is everywhere. So what John is doing is, if you can imagine this, he's got
Daniel and Ezekiel.
Well, yeah, Daniel,
those
Ezekiel, Exodus.
They have apocalyptic nature to them. Yeah.
And we're going to talk about what apocalypse really meant in ancient Judaism, not what we think it means.
Isn't that a really good movie by no?
Yeah, that's right. That word, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. And we do that with apocalypse all the time. But what John often does is, if you can imagine him with a shovel or a scoop, he will scoop out of these allusions, especially in Ezekiel and Daniel, and then put them into the soil of something he's trying to plant here. That's not a very good way to put it, but hundreds of allusions. And so if you don't know your Old Testament, you are going to go off the deep end. Mm-hmm. And many people have gone off the deep end with this letter. Number one, we are not, as non-Jewish Christians, we're not familiar with Torah and the prophets of the Old Testament, but we've also tried to interpret it outside of the magisterium of the church too. So that also sends us out of the deep end. But anyway, I love this letter. And that's actually an important key to understanding it. So, but it's thoroughly ensconced in the Old Testament. And so if you're a Jewish hearer of John's apocalypse, and remember, this would have been read in a church. This would have been read in public worship.
Well, it was written even.
Yes, it was written, but it would have been
churches.
read in the churches. And maybe we start there. It's written to 7 churches. And these churches would have existed in Turkey. You could look on a map now in Turkey. And if you were a mail carrier, and depending on which route you took, you would stop at every one of the churches in the order in which John addresses them. That's what this is. So let's bring it down to earth.
All right.
It's not a code about what Iraq's going to do in the year 2100 in league with Israel and the United States, and the world's going to end. It's none of that. So just a couple things I will say to it about this great document. Number one, it is an apocalypse. So let's talk about that. An apocalypse in ancient Judaism never meant end of the world stuff. Apocalypse, surprisingly enough, was a literary genre. It was a style of writing and a style of speaking. And you just named it. What's an apocalyptic book in the Old Testament?
Daniel.
Daniel is an apocalypse. Now, the imagery used in the book of Daniel and the imagery used in Revelation had a primary purpose, and that was to get your attention. Because remember, in the ancient world, they didn't have movie screens. They weren't looking at special effects. What I like to say about apocalyptic writing is that it's kind of the CGI of language.
Like Lucasfilms.
Yes, it's the CGI of language. That's what it's meant. Apocalypse in ancient Judaism was often very dualistic. You know, there was good and there was evil. There were the good guys and there were the bad guys, and you're either the one or the other. But the imagery used in Apocalypse addressed a contemporary historical event in just far more arresting terms. So a primary literary device in Jewish apocalypticism was beasts. Right? I saw a beast. I saw this beast, and it had 7 heads or 5 heads, whatever,
10 horns,
9 horns, 10 horns. Okay, well, we're like, well, what does that mean? It must be a code. Let's go start, finding. And we imagine like literal beasts coming out of a literal ocean.
Well, that's what I do. I have to, I would think anybody would without any direction. Go, well, of course that's what I'm going to do. You're trying to draw it in your head, and it's like 10 eyes with 10 hands and, 11 fingers, and, it's like, what?
Yes.
Well, it is really uncanny.
It is, but...
Unless you're a Star Trek fan, then you can...
Right. That's right.
Like, I can imagine this.
Yes. But the beasts in Daniel represented nations or empires.
Okay.
And of course, Daniel says that. That's not controversial to say, all right? Empires, nations, beasts. They're beasts, right? They're not lambs. Well, a lamb is a little gentle. They're beasts, right? They're up to no good. There's something happening in the regime. Well, John uses this beastly image, but he's not talking about literal beasts coming out of the ground. He's talking about the empire of his day. Who was the empire during the time in which John was writing Revelation? That's not a trick question.
Rome.
The Roman Empire. Now, by calling the Roman Empire using these beastly characteristics, what is John doing then for the listeners who are living in the Roman Empire? Apocalyptic, everybody, was a way of demythologizing the propaganda that the empires used to justify and promote their agenda. Okay? I'm going to give you an example of how we could speak apocalyptically. Let's go back to the last presidential election. Some of you found it to be apocalyptic, okay? Some of us Catholics is apocalyptic. Now, if I were to say to you, in the year 2020, I, Shane, saw a elephant sitting on the throne. And from the west, I saw a donkey. And there was a great clash between the elephant and the donkey swallowed the elephant and sat on the throne for a quadrennia. What have I just described, Father Rossi?
The 2020 election.
The 2020 election. We know what that image meant. Right? It's another way to describe the Democrat defeating the Republican, and who is now going to be in power for 4 years. It's not a code about the end of the world.
Yeah. That's a really good analogy. That's pretty impressive.
Isn't that good?
That's
somebody,
really
you
good.
need to write that
I hope
down.
Everybody heard that and it was just dropped your coffee. Like, this is unbelievable. I've never heard this example.
That's what it means. Sure. Okay, so let's talk about another means of propaganda that the Roman Empire often used to promote its agenda. We've heard of the Pax Romana. Mm-hmm. The peace of Rome.
Yes.
We're such a Rome presented.
After we've decimated you now have peace.
Because you're already into it,
right?
Because we're on this side.
We went to the Holy Land.
Yes.
And we saw when the Romans came.
But the Romans, yes, they leveled. They destroyed cities. They plundered them.
Because everyone's dead.
Everyone's dead. So, but the Roman Empire did not call it death. They did not call themselves warmongers. Mm-hmm. They promoted themselves as being a very peaceful and righteous people committed to justice for the world. Okay, one of the images that Rome used to use to promote its agenda was a goddess. Roma was her name. You could look this up. Roma, voluptuous, woman of great strength and beauty. Well, what if you see images of Roma in the cities in which you're living because you're now a citizen of the Roman Empire?
Got it.
You're living there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I come along and write you a letter and say, that woman that represents Rome, she's a harlot, drunk with the blood of martyrs. What have I just done to that image of the goddess Roma? What have I just done with that?
You've changed its meaning.
I have changed its meaning. I have made you look at that statue differently. So I am unmasking the propaganda. She's not peaceful. Right. You just said it. She's not this voluptuous woman who's worthy of our affection. she is, we'll just put it, she's evil.
Mm-hmm.
It would be the equivalent. Now, this is provocative. It would be the equivalent. What's the icon of the United States who's a woman? Do we have a woman that represents the United States?
The Statue of Liberty.
We have the Statue of Liberty. Isn't it interesting that we use these means that the ancients used to kind of promote ourselves, right? So she's a symbol. But what if I said to you, she's a harlot, drunk on the blood of the poor. All of a sudden, I have just arrested your attention. I've made you see something that you did not see before. That's the purpose of apocalyptic. That's what it does. It makes you see the world
reality,
non-propagandized by the imperial regime.
Well, divine revelation comes in to see the world according to really God's worldview.
Yes.
And that's God's worldview, saying that this is, you take off the propaganda of the nationalistic worldview that we can all, and we do in some ways, it's kind of hard not to, but that say, no, this is God's worldview, that God doesn't see it from a nationalism standpoint where nations are really meant to be great, and there'll be one nation will be God's gift to another and whatnot, that nations in the end, Jesus says, war and nations rise and fall, kingdoms rise and fall, that there's really no nation that is sort of exempt from struggle and being misled, misused, and abusive to other nations, and that even Judaism fell into that trap, right? They believed that because we are the nation, the Jewish nation, we are God's chosen nation, and therefore the Messiah will come to us, and we are already the chosen people because of our nationality and the DNA and the genetics of our lives being Jewish, that we are in the nation of Judaism, of Israel, and therefore we are God's chosen people.
We're right and we're just.
But then the Lord Jesus comes along with his preaching, and then even to stand there, and this is coming up in the readings of Sunday, but to stand there in the temple, and I learned this recently that, okay, so what was going on in the temple in Jerusalem was it wasn't just the place of worship. I learned this recently. It was also like saying it's like the White House and the Pentagon and all the structures of your nation were in the temple and around it. Just that, like, this was the entire national identity, including, most importantly, it was God's dwelling. But the taxes, the collections, and people's just taxes of living in the civilization were all run through the temple in some way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when Jesus comes along and stands in the temple, and this is of course the second temple that was rebuilt by King Herod, and says, I'm going to destroy this temple, right? That's what I'm saying. I'm going to, there'll be no more government building on the face of this nation, or whatever, and no church or something like that.
It's a scandal.
Yeah. So,
but even Jeremiah, when the religious leaders would always say, "Well, we have the temple of the Lord. The Lord's on our side. We're the chosen people." It was Jeremiah said, "Don't say the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Don't say there's peace when there's really violence and war." Well, that's kind of what apocalyptic language can do. It unmasks our pretenses, because I don't care which empire or which nation, no nation has ever done anything really unjust. Everything's justified. And it's always in the name of peace. But what John does see is that, wow, the Roman Empire, they may be promoting themselves as righteous and just, and that the gods are on our side, but they are slaughtering the innocent. Now, that'll become more explicit as you get deeper into, especially chapter 18, which is my favorite chapter, but we'll get to that in a couple of weeks. But that's the purpose of apocalypse. It's not a code, everybody. It is a way of unmasking the pretenses of an imperial regime that John realized was destroying God's people. And that's why he refers to Rome as Babylon throughout the rest of the letter. Babylon. Yeah, he calls it a harlot drunk with the blood of martyrs too, but Rome is often referred to Babylon. Why? There's another place where it's called Egypt. Why? Well, Babylon was the empire that destroyed God's people. And so what John's saying is that Rome is just another Babylon. They're killing the innocent. They're slaughtering the righteous. They're slaughtering God's people. Don't pledge your allegiance to this nation. And that's really what John is warning the Christians about in this letter, is that God is about to execute judgment on this corrupt and unjust empire. Don't be complicit in it, because if you're complicit in what it's doing, you'll go down with the ship. But we'll get into that a little bit more. Questions about that? I mean, does that make sense?
Sure. No, those are
okay.
Great.
So it's an apocalypse. Number one, literary genre, not a code. Second, it is a prophecy, but it's Jewish prophecy. Most of us in 21st century, the West or anywhere else, we think prophecy means predicting the future. There's an element of that. We kind of think it's Nostradamus stuff. But biblical prophecy is not so much about predicting what shall happen one day, although there are elements of that in there. I mean, the prophecies pointing to Jesus, the coming Messiah. Sure. But a prophecy was always understood to be a message of divine truth spoken to a contemporary people. So when you say a word of truth to us from the pulpit, for instance, that's prophetic. But you're not speaking to us for Christians who are going to live 2,000 years from now. Are you with me?
Yeah, I do.
So it is a prophecy, but a prophecy understood for the people to whom you're writing. It's a message of truth for them. Not necessarily, well, let's put this together. Let's see. One day Russia's going to do this, and then I guess Iraq's going to do this. Because one of the words that John begins, and I didn't have it marked, so you'll just have to trust me from memory here. He begins, and Jesus says, write these things down because all this is about to happen soon. Everything I'm getting ready to tell you is going to be happening soon. And I remember there was a professor who said, class, what does soon mean? Does it mean 2,000 years into the future? Mm-hmm. No, it doesn't. Mm-hmm. It means soon. Now, what we have to do on this side of the resurrection is apply this letter's truths to our context. And that's where the challenges really come in. That's where its relevance really comes in as well. Okay, so it's an apocalypse, it's a prophecy, a message of divine truth in the here and now. And therefore, as a prophecy, it can apply to every generation. Just like we're reading Isaiah the prophet. When he was writing and preaching, he was speaking to a people getting ready to go into exile. And it happened. And then people who were in exile, and it happened. He wasn't saying, you guys don't matter. I'm going to speak to a generation thousands of years from now. But because he spoke a message of divine truth, it applies to all generations. And then the third thing, and I guess I'll just end here, and we'll pick up next week and look at some of the passages. It is a letter. Say that with me. It is a letter. This
not a letter of the alphabet?
No. When you write a letter to someone, Father, when do you intend them to read it and to understand it?
Hopefully right when they receive it.
Yes. It's a letter. When Paul was writing his letters, he was writing to address situations for them then. Now, he was being prophetic because we can apply his truths in his letters to the Corinthians and to the Philippians. These were communities. We can apply his great theology in our context now because he was speaking truth. But Revelation is a letter like that. It was meant to address those people who lived then. Who? Well, John tells you right out of the gate, 7 churches. And I don't have the name of the churches like Philadelphia, Sardis, Laodicea, Smyrna. Mm-hmm. These are churches that are actually situated in, if you go get an ancient map, you can look at it there in modern day Turkey. And you have like 4 churches in a row in one side, and they're parallel to each other, and 3 like this. So if you were a mail carrier and you started one of the churches, you could do a route, and you would actually visit each church in the order in which John's addressing them here. So this letter was meant to be circulated to address those churches living in that time and in that context. Not for Christians living 3,000 years later. Mm-hmm. And so
that's the historical context.
That's the context.
Right? Yeah, and that's important for interpreting sacred scripture for any letter or anything we read, but it also, we got to be cautious about historical critical where you sort of pull out and get, forget that it is divine to revelation. Mm-hmm. Even still, it's like, no, they didn't write it for 2,000 years later, but the Lord used that mode of communicating, that genre of literature to communicate salvation.
Yes. Now, I do think, I think it's an argument worth making that why would John write such a strange apocalyptic letter? Why would he write something in an apocalyptic genre to these Christians situated in Turkey, modern day Turkey? Well, if it is a diatribe against the pretenses of the empire, if a Roman soldier would have come across this letter, he wouldn't know how to make heads or tails with it. That's apocalyptic. I just spoke in apocalyptic heads or tails. He wouldn't know how to. He wouldn't know how to. He would not know what to do with it. So it could very well be that he wrote this intentionally in apocalyptic, so that it could not be interpreted by the Roman overlords at the time.
So in a sense, there is a code, sort of,
but it's addressing the then, the now at that point in time. Now there are those who say, well, what John is actually trying to do is that many of these churches are being persecuted by the Romans, and we know what the Romans did to the early Christians, especially during the reign of Nero and Diocletian. It was horrible for them. So there are some of these communities that were under that kind of persecution, but here's what we missed. Not all of them. We'll maybe look at Laodicea next week. The Christians at Laodicea were very comfortable. They were doing great. So what John is going to do is his apocalypse is a warning to these churches about what will happen if they don't heed his message when God judges the Roman Empire for its evil, wickedness, violence, and corruption. Because if you, for lack of a better word, if you are in league with Rome, if you get in bed with Rome, that's basically what he's saying. Because the gospel message was spreading to the non-Jews, right? If you make your bed with the Romans and with the empire and that regime, what God's going to do to it, you'll go down with the ship too. The verse, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, that I think is at the center of this apocalypse is in chapter 18, and it is an angel who addresses the Christians. And the angel says, the angel cried out with strong voice, Babylon the great is fallen. Who's Babylon? Who is the
Rome.
That's Roman.
Yep.
Babylon the great is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils. But then the angel says to the faithful, come out from her, my people, and do not participate in her sins, and so that you will not receive her plagues. So what John is writing here, Father, and this is not my word, this is the language of other scholars who've read this. This is the first Christian political resistance document ever written. It is a political resistance document. Come out of her, come out of Rome, come out of what Rome is doing, is what John is saying, lest you participate in her sins. In other words, you'll be judged with her. So we would say, as a modern way to translate come out of her, is opt out, opt out, opt out. Opt out of Rome's way of doing things. Well, what was Rome's way of doing things? Well, you'll just have to stay tuned.
Yes. So next time we read Laodicea,
we'll look at some of the. We'll look at the letters to
open the book.
We'll open the book.
Okay. So give them a little homework.
Yes. Open the book and look at the pattern and how John addresses the churches, how Jesus addresses the churches through John, and then there's a section on judgments. We'll need to put that in context. Keep your Old Testament thoughts going because it's so much Old Testament imagery there. And then we'll get to the climax of the letter when God does judge Rome, judges the empire for its exploitative, extractive economy and its violence, all under the guise of peace. Remember, we're a peaceful people. That's what Rome said. We're peaceful. And then we'll get to the very climax of for those who can endure. John uses that word over and over. If you can overcome. And what he means is that it's going to be hard to do this. It's going to be hard to opt out. But if you can endure, even at the risk of your own life, because you might get killed for this, you will reign with the martyrs in white robes. And so maybe we can also talk about kind of what the numerology meant, what 7 meant in the ancient Judaism, 10, the colors of white and red. But my point for this podcast and for all of our listeners, let's not go out into the outlandish. Let's bring it down to earth and really understand what John is saying.
So you're not going to decode for us.
I'm not decoding anything.
week.
You'll have to tune in next time.
Just want to know.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, thank you very much for humoring me, Father, with that. Yeah. So any closing remarks? I've talked like the whole time.
Maranatha, Maranatha, Jesus is
Lord
coming
Jesus,
soon.
come.
That's the last, right?
And will that be good news or bad news?
It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, that was
Yeah,
the best part.
that was the
That's
song,
the
yeah.
ultimate message. It is not predicting the end of the world. It is prophesying the end of the world as we know it now. What John sees is a new creation coming, where the stuff involved in history, corruption, oppression, violence, killing the innocent, all of that's what's going to end. But the world itself,
Restored.
that's going to remain, and it's going to be renewed and restored. That's apocalyptic, understood rightly.
Praise the Lord.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening, and join us next week. We'll start digging into the letter. And if you want to follow the church's, the Divine Office, the Liturgy of the Hours, we are reading it now. We're coming up near the end of it. But the church has been reading Revelation really since the octave of Easter. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it is the document for us. So thank you for joining us. If you want more information about our great parish, please visit our website at stmccg.org. Until next week, on behalf of Father Rossi, I am Shane Page. God bless.